The Titanic's final voice was not a scream from her decks, but a stream of dots and dashes tapped into the night. These were the last wireless messages sent by young operators fighting against time as the ship sank. For most passengers, the radio had been a luxury, a way to send playful notes across the Atlantic. But when the iceberg struck, that same machine became the only bridge between life and death for over 2,000 people. Each message carried both fear and duty. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sat in the cramped Marconi room, headphones pressed to their ears, their fingers stiff on the key. They sent out words like CQD and SOS, each signal echoing across the ocean in search of help. Other ships strained to listen, their operators hearing a mixture of clear distress calls and broken bursts of static. To experts today, these signals are more than history. They are the last trace of Titanic alive, a human heartbeat turned into sound. And among those final transmissions was one mysterious burst of noise, remembered as the death scream, the last faint cry before silence. More than a century later, historians still pause when they read those final dots and dashes. It was not just a ship sinking. It was a voice fading forever into the dark Atlantic. Dots and dashes of doom. In April 1912, the language of life and death was not spoken with words but tapped out in dots and dashes. Morse code carried Titanic's final story across the Atlantic, turning the ship's tragedy into signals every operator could understand. At first, those dots and dashes were filled with light messages from passengers, reports of poker games, jokes, and proud notes like, "Fine voyage," "Fine ship." They were ordinary voices stretched across the sea, unaware of what was to come. But after the collision at 11:40 p.m., everything changed. The same wireless set that once carried playful chatter now became Titanic's last hope. Jack Phillips, the senior operator, and Harold Bride, his young assistant, tapped out messages with urgency. CQD and SOS filled the night, repeated again and again, each sequence sharp and relentless. To them, it was not just code, it was a lifeline, a desperate call for rescue. Other ships picked up the sounds, some close, some far, and some, like the Californian, tragically silent. Each signal marked another minute slipping away as water poured into the hull. The dots and dashes of doom were the heartbeat of a dying ship, proof that even as Titanic sank, her voice refused to vanish. Those sounds, recorded in ship logs, still chill us today. They remind us that the greatest disaster at sea was told in the simplest language: 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, SOS. The Marconi room, hidden deep inside Titanic, was a small, cramped cabin filled with wires, coils, and the steady hum of electricity. This was the Marconi room, the ship's radio heart. Passengers saw it as a marvel of modern luxury. For a fee, they could send a telegram across the Atlantic, bragging about the voyage or sharing news with family. Few realized that this little room would become the stage of Titanic's final struggle. Its call sign was MGY, short and simple, yet powerful enough to reach Cape Race in Newfoundland and beyond. 2 young men kept it alive: Jack Phillips, only 25, and Harold Bride, just 22. Their days were long, often 12 hours or more, as they cleared a backlog of messages for first-class passengers. Headphones pressed tight, they lived in a blur of static and code, their fingers tapping out endless replies. It was tiring work, but it gave Titanic a voice stronger than flags or lamps could ever provide. On April 14th, after the iceberg strike, the Marconi room transformed from a place of routine business into the last lifeline of the ship. Every word tapped inside those walls carried the weight of over 2,000 lives. The clatter of the key, the faint spark in the air, they became the sound of Titanic speaking to the world for the last time. Call sign MGY. Every ship at sea had its own unique identity in Morse code, and Titanic's was MGY. Just 3 letters, yet they became forever tied to the most haunting disaster in maritime history. At first, MGY was used for simple messages, relaying notes from wealthy passengers to friends and family back home. Operators at Cape Race in Newfoundland saw it as routine, just another busy liner crossing the Atlantic. But when the iceberg ripped open Titanic's hull, MGY transformed from a mark of luxury into a cry for help. At Point Phillips tapped out the first distress QD MGY, position 41.46 and 50.400 W. In that moment, the world learned Titanic was sinking. Across the airwaves, ships like the Frankfurt, the Mount Temple, and the Carpathia heard MGY, each operator suddenly aware that history was unfolding in real time. To them, MGY no longer meant glamour. It meant desperation, thousands of lives hanging by a thread. Even after Titanic slipped beneath the waves, other ships kept calling MGY into the night, refusing to believe the silence. Logs from that night still record those unanswered calls, each one echoing into emptiness. Today, the letters MGY stand not just for a ship but for a voice that spoke until it was swallowed by the sea. A luxury-turned lifeline, when Titanic set sail, her wireless radio was seen as a symbol of progress and prestige. First-class passengers used it like a novelty, sending cheerful telegrams across the Atlantic. They wrote about fine dinners, calm seas, poker games, and even bragged, "Fine voyage, fine ship." To them, the Marconi system was entertainment, proof that Titanic was the most modern ship afloat. But luxury became survival the moment the iceberg struck. Suddenly, the wireless was no longer carrying light-hearted chatter but desperate signals for help. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sat in the hot, cramped cabin, sending out CQD and SOS again and again, their fingers racing against time. Messages that once carried laughter now carried fear. "We have struck iceberg. Sinking fast." Ships hundreds of miles away listened and answered, some turning toward Titanic, others powerless to arrive in time. The very machine that had once delivered love notes and business deals became the last hope for over 2,000 souls. The transformation was stark. From a toy of the wealthy to the only voice left for the doomed ship, each spark, each code tapped out into the darkness, was a reminder that technology meant nothing unless it could save lives. That night, Titanic's luxury became her final lifeline. Jack Phillips at the key. Jack Phillips, Titanic's senior wireless operator, was only 25, yet the weight of 2,000 lives rested on his shoulders. He had already endured long, exhausting days clearing a backlog of passenger telegrams after the radio set broke earlier in the voyage. Known for his sharp skill and quick temper, Phillips lived with headphones clamped tight, tapping out endless streams of Morse code. On the night of April 14th, he was buried in passenger traffic when Cyril Evans, operator of the nearby Californian, tried to send another iceberg warning. Irritated, Phillips snapped back, "Shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Those words would haunt history as Evans turned off his set, leaving the closest ship deaf to Titanic's future cries. But when the iceberg struck, Phillips' professionalism overcame his fatigue. At 12:15 a.m., he sent the first desperate CQD, followed by SOS. Hour after hour, he hammered the key, repeating positions, answering replies, and urging ships to come at once. Even as water crept closer and chaos raged above, he would not abandon his post. Survivor Harold Bride later said he would never forget Phillips' steady rhythm in the final 15 minutes. It was not just code, it was courage tapped into the night. Harold Bride's duty at just 22 years old, Harold Bride was Titanic's junior wireless operator, quiet and diligent beside the more experienced Jack Phillips. Bride had been trained for long hours and steady nerves, but nothing could prepare him for the night of April 14th. When the iceberg tore open the hull, he stood by Phillips, relaying signals and helping transmit Titanic's desperate calls. Unlike Phillips, Bride had a personal bond with another operator, Harold Cottam of the Carpathia. The two men were friends, often exchanging light-hearted banter across the Atlantic. Fate tied them together that night, one tapping out cries for help as his ship died, the other straining to hear and respond. Bride's sense of duty never faltered. Even as the ship listed and the wireless room grew colder, he urged Phillips to switch between CQD and the new SOS, joking grimly, "It may be your last chance to send it." Hours later, when Titanic's power faded, Bride tried to drag Phillips away, but his colleague returned to the key. Bride himself was swept into the freezing Atlantic, clinging to an overturned lifeboat until Carpathia arrived. Injured and exhausted, he still reported for duty, joining Cottam aboard Carpathia's wireless room to send survivor messages. Duty defined him, even after surviving hell. Missed warning from Californian: the most tragic moment of Titanic's wireless story came hours before she struck the iceberg. Cyril Evans, the lone operator on the nearby Californian, tried to warn Titanic about dangerous ice. He tapped out a message reporting his ship had stopped for the night, surrounded by a field of ice. Jack Phillips, drowning in passenger telegrams, snapped back sharply, "Shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Stung by the rebuke, Evans switched off his set and went to bed. That decision meant the Californian, the closest ship to Titanic, never heard her frantic CQD and SOS signals later that night. Instead, operators on ships hundreds of miles away strained to catch her weakening calls while the nearest help sat in silence. Historians often mark this exchange as one of the cruelest twists of fate in the disaster. A single moment of irritation, a single wireless operator silenced, left more than 2,000 people without the rescue they might have had. When rockets lit the sky above Titanic, officers on the Californian saw them but did not respond, assuming they were company signals. The missed warning was a fatal link in the chain of errors, proving how silence on the airwaves can be as deadly as ice in the water. Friendship with Carpathia, among the many threads of Titanic's wireless story, one stands out as deeply human. The friendship between Harold Bride and Harold Cottam, the operator aboard the Carpathia. The two young men had exchanged countless light-hearted messages before the voyage, joking across the Atlantic in the easy slang of wireless operators who called each other "old man." On the night of April 14th, that bond became a lifeline. When Titanic sent her first CQD, it was Cottam who caught the signal. At first, he thought it was a mistake, but when Bride and Phillips confirmed the ship was sinking, Cottam rushed to his captain and pushed him to turn Carpathia around. Through the night, Bride and Cottam were tied together by invisible waves of sound, one sending Titanic's pleas as the water rose, the other urging his ship forward at full speed. Hours later, after Bride survived the freezing sea and was hauled aboard Carpathia, fate brought the friends face to face. Despite his injuries, Bride joined Cottam in the wireless room, helping send survivor messages to desperate families ashore. Their friendship had carried from jokes in peacetime to cries in disaster, and finally to hope in survival. It was proof that behind the cold dots and dashes were hearts beating in unison. Light words before dark hours before disaster struck, Titanic's wireless room was filled with chatter that now feels ghostly. Passengers treated the radio like a novelty, sending telegrams across the Atlantic as if they were postcards. Some were playful, "Dining with you in spirit, heart with you always." Others were blunt, "No sickness. All well. Notify all interested in poker." One even declared with pride, "Fine voyage, fine ship," words that would later echo with bitter irony. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride tapped these out with routine skill, their headphones buzzing with constant traffic. Operators across the ocean replied with the same casual slang, calling each other "old man," as if they were boys in a club. It was a world of light, ordinary words stretched across the sea, proof of modern luxury and connection. But those same messages, when read today, feel like voices from the edge of doom. Hours after the last cheerful telegram left Titanic, the same key would hammer out CQD and SOS, cries for rescue instead of jokes or affection. The wireless had turned from entertainment into survival in a matter of minutes. The contrast is haunting. Laughter and love 1 hour, desperation the next. Those light words preserved in logs are now shadows before the storm. CQD. The first call at 20:15 a.m. On April 15, 1912, the Titanic spoke her first cry for help. Jack Phillips, with Harold Bride at his side, tapped out the code known to every wireless operator: CQMGY. Position 4146N 50.4W. CQD was the Marconi Company's distress signal, short for "Come Quick, Danger." It was a call that carried urgency, but also professionalism, not panic, just precision. Within minutes, ships across the Atlantic began to respond. The German liner Frankfurt asked what had happened. Phillips' answer was chilling. "We have struck iceberg, sinking by the head." Other ships quickly relayed the call. The Mount Temple broadcast Titanic's plight to every station it could reach. At Cape Race in Newfoundland, operators forwarded the news to New York. What began as a single spark in a cramped radio room now echoed across the ocean. For the first time, Titanic admitted openly that she was in mortal danger. Those letters, CQDMG wife, marked the turning point of the night. Only hours before, Titanic's radio had carried poker jokes and dinner plans. Now it was carrying history's most famous distress call, the start of a desperate chorus that would not end until the ship was gone. Why hit an iceberg? Just minutes after sending CQD, Titanic made the truth clear to the world. Jack Phillips, steady at the key, replied to a nearby ship, "Why have struck iceberg, sinking by the head." The words were short, plain, and without emotion, yet behind them lay panic spreading through the decks. On the bridge, officers were still trying to grasp the damage. In the boiler rooms, men fought to hold back the sea. But in the Marconi room, there was no time for confusion. Phillips and Bride tapped out the message again and again, telling ships across the Atlantic what had happened. The Frankfurt, Mount Temple, Virginian, and others strained to listen, some close enough to reply, others too far to offer timely help. Each response carried the weight of realization: the unsinkable Titanic was admitting defeat. Even as passengers dined and laughed above, unaware of the full danger, the operators were spelling out her doom to strangers in the night. The phrase, "struck iceberg," became the first blunt obituary of the great ship. Cold, efficient Morse code stripped of drama, but more haunting because of it. In those few words, the largest vessel afloat had confessed its fate, and the clock towards silence had begun. Carpathia hears the cry at 12:25 a.m. The message that would define history reached the ears of Harold Cottam, the wireless operator aboard the Cunard liner Carpathia. He had been about to go to bed, headphones still on, when Titanic's CQD cut through the static. At first, he thought it was an error. "Do you know you are calling Cape Race?" he asked. Jack Phillips' reply left no doubt: Titanic was sinking. Cottam rushed to Captain Arthur Rostron, who immediately ordered Carpathia turned around. Engines roared to life, straining at full speed toward Titanic's coordinates. The voyage would take 4 long hours, but Cottam's steady replies brought at least a thread of hope. "Coming hard as we can, old man, all our boats ready." That last line, "old man," was the friendly slang of wireless operators, a human bond in the middle of crisis. To Phillips and Bride, hunched over their set, it was a lifeline not just of steel but of words. As flares fired above Titanic's decks and lifeboats were lowered into black water, the operators knew help was on the way. Carpathia's promise became the heartbeat of the night. Too far to arrive in time to save all, but close enough to save some. Ships answer from afar. Once Titanic's distress calls filled the air, ships across the Atlantic began to answer. Some were close, some impossibly far, but all felt the weight of the signals. The German liner Frankfurt was the first to respond, asking Titanic what was wrong. Phillips' reply was stark: "We have struck iceberg, sinking." Soon after, the Mount Temple relayed the warning outward, ensuring every station could hear Titanic's call. The Cunard liner Carpathia promised to come at full speed, though she was still 4 hours away. Even the Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, answered from hundreds of miles distant, straining to reach her doomed twin. Other ships, like the Virginian and Burma, also turned toward the coordinates, but their distance made rescue impossible. The Californian, the closest of all, sat in silence. Her wireless switched off for the night. For Phillips and Bride, each reply brought hope, but also despair. Help was listening, but time was running faster than any ship could steam. In the logs of that night, the voices of distant ships stand out as haunting echoes, each one promising aid, each one too far to prevent disaster. Titanic's signals had reached the world, but the world could not reach her in time. The first SOS ever sent at 12:45 a.m. in the middle of chaos, Titanic made history. Until then, Jack Phillips had been using CQD, the older distress call, but Harold Bride, trying to lighten the tension, joked grimly, "Send SOS. It's the new call, and it may be your last chance." Phillips tapped it out 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. It was the first time SOS was used in a disaster of such scale. Unlike CQD, SOS was simple, universal, and impossible to confuse. Soon Titanic was alternating between the two signals, filling the night with both cries for help. To Bride and Phillips, it may have felt like stacking pleas on top of each other, hoping one might carry farther. Across the Atlantic, operators recorded the moment with awe. SOS, once just a news standard, had now been baptized in tragedy. From that night onward, it became the world's single voice of distress, understood in every language by every ship. Titanic's first SOS was more than a code. It was the voice of a dying ship, etched forever into history. Even today, those 3 short bursts of sound echo louder than words, the shorthand of desperation, born in the freezing Atlantic. Women and children in boats. By 1:30 a.m., Titanic's signals carried a new, desperate tone. The earlier messages had been urgent but calm. Now Jack Phillips tapped out words heavy with fear. "We are putting women off in boats." It was a blunt admission that the situation was beyond control. On deck, lifeboats were being lowered into the icy dark, many only half full, while over 2,000 people remained aboard. Phillips and Harold Bride relayed updates with shaking hands, their key sending the heartbeat of a dying ship. "Cannot last much longer." Other ships answered with promises, Carpathia urging, "Coming as fast as we can." But no reassurance could change the truth. Every signal that left the Marconi room was a window into the chaos above. Flares bursting in the sky, crew shouting orders, passengers huddled in terror. For families, those simple words, "woman in boats," were the last glimpse of loved ones fighting for survival. To Bride and Phillips, each message was more than code, it was the sound of time running out. They kept tapping as the ship tilted, determined to speak until silence claimed them. These transmissions remain among the most human of all, stark reminders that courage endures even when hope fades. "Come quick," nearly full. As the night wore on, Titanic's signals grew more urgent, more haunting. Around 1:45 a.m., Jack Phillips sent a stark update, "Come quick. Engine room nearly full." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of doom. Water was rising fast, flooding the very heart of the ship. Below deck, engineers and firemen worked in darkness, trying to keep pumps alive, but the sea was winning. In the Marconi room, Phillips and Harold Bride kept tapping, their hands stiff from cold, the floor slanting beneath them. Each message was a final cry into the night, desperate for ships that were still too far away. Carpathia answered again and again, "Coming hard as we can." But distance mocked every promise. Other liners strained to listen, logging Titanic's words like epitaphs written in Morse code. To the operators it was clear time was gone. Still, they refused to stop. Phillips hammered out every phrase with precision, as if order could hold back chaos. Bride stood by, exhausted yet steady. "Come quick," nearly full. It was more than a status report. It was the voice of a giant dying, the sound of steel and men surrendering to the sea. The death scream at 2017. At about 2017 a.m., Titanic's steady voice suddenly broke. Until then, Jack Phillips had kept tapping SOS and CQD, even as water crept closer to the Marconi room. Then, operators on distant ships reported hearing something strange. Not a clear message, but a burst of sound, jagged and broken, exploding into their headphones. Some described it as static, others as a final, frantic signal. Historians later called it Titanic's death scream. Was it Phillips trying one last time to send SOS before the power failed? Or was it the sound of the ship itself, her dynamos shorting out as seawater swallowed them? No one can be certain. What is known is that this final burst came at the precise moment Titanic broke apart. 3 minutes later, she was gone. That faint, chaotic noise remains one of the most chilling artifacts of the disaster. A moment when a ship seemed to cry out as she died. To the men listening across the Atlantic, it was unforgettable, a sound that left them speechless. More than a century later, that death scream still lingers in history, the last echo of Titanic before silence claimed her forever. Silence after 2020. By 2020 AM, Titanic was gone. Her bow plunged beneath the waves, her stern rose into the night, and then the great ship broke apart and vanished into the Atlantic. On the airwaves, her voice vanished too. For hours, operators on other ships continued to call her call sign MG hoping for a reply. At 20:35 AM, Carpathia sent, "If you are there, we are firing rockets." At 2:58 AM, the Burma tried, "Hope you are safe." But there was no answer. The silence was deafening. The operators who had listened all night, their ears pressed to headphones, realized with growing horror that they were speaking to a grave. To them, Titanic was not just a ship but a voice, and that voice had been cut off forever. The unanswered signals became a kind of epitaph, proof that death at sea is not always marked by screams, but by silence. Historians later said these unanswered calls were as haunting as Titanic's own distress. For while the ship's last SOS was desperate, the silence that followed was worse. The empty void where a voice had been, reminding the world that 1,500 souls had gone with it into the deep. Bride survives, Phillips lost. When the Marconi room finally filled with water, Harold Bride tried to drag Jack Phillips away from the quay. Phillips had refused to stop, hammering out signals until the last possible second. Forced into a life jacket, he staggered from his post, but not far. Minutes later, the ship broke apart. Bride was thrown into the freezing sea, fighting for breath in the black water. He managed to cling to an overturned collapsible lifeboat, half frozen and with crushed feet. Around him floated dozens of men, silent in shock. Phillips may have reached the same boat for a time, but if he did, the ocean soon claimed him. Some survivors said he slipped away from exhaustion, others that he succumbed to the cold. His body was never recovered. Bride, only 22, endured the night in agony but lived to see Carpathia's lights on the horizon. There, fate dealt a cruel twist. The Carpathia's operator was his friend Harold Cottam. Though injured and barely able to stand,